Hi, my name is Joyce Majure. Today is April 12th, 2004. We are in Green Bay, Wisconsin, interviewing my grandpa, Kenneth Bourne, who came up from Chicago, Illinois. He was born on February 17th, 1915. My father, Roger Majure, is taping this interview. What wars did you serve in?
I served in World War II,
Where?
ultimately in the South Pacific.
What rank were you?
I went up through the ranks from private to private, first class, corporal, sergeant, and I was a tech sergeant for all the time I served in the Pacific Theater.
What branch were you in the...
I was in the Army Corps of Engineers.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted. I tried to enlist in the Navy, but I couldn't make the weight requirements. I was too light. So I waited till I was drafted, which was a short time later, and I went to camp. I went to Fort Sheridan, where I was inducted. At Fort Sheridan, you went before a classification board, and they had quotas for that they had to fill, and these interviewers, classification experts, would assign the people to whatever branch of service that they had need for or they felt that they belonged into. I was there about 2 weeks, and I went with 70 other fellows to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, which was the Corps of Engineers. There were 2 engineering training camps. Fort Belvoir, founded by George Washington, who was considered an engineer, and the other one was in just outside of St. Louis. So there are only 2 engineering training camps in the United States.
Do you recall your first days in service?
The first days in service, well, you went before the classification board and who assigned you, and so they had quotas, as I said, to fill, and they classified you, and then you went to these various branches of service.
Do you remember your first instructions?
The first what?
Instructions.
Like boot camp.
At Fort Belvoir, the engineering training arrangement at that time was 16 weeks. The first 5 weeks was to get you toughened up and get you physically fit and whatnot. And it started out with just a 5-mile walk, and then it graduated into a 12-mile hike, and then you added your full equipment and whatnot. And then in the final weeks, you had a 30-mile march with all your equipment, but the most grueling one was a 20-mile forced march with all your equipment. And the forced march was really the one that really was the ultimate final graduating arrangement, as you might say. Go ahead.
When you got out of training, where did you go?
When I finished basic training, then I went into for 2 5-week terms training. I went into the training battalion, and which consisted of rifle marksmanship, and you're gradually getting all your muscles and whatnot acclimated, and then the rest of the training period in the engineers was bridge building, demolitions, all that type of stuff that the engineers furnished for other branches of service, building pontoon bridges or regular bridges, or for demolition work is what the final weeks were of the 16 weeks of basic training.
So what did you do after the basic training? Did
After
you
basic training, and I spent these two 5-week terms training other trainees, I went to Rutgers University for 3 months, and we were doing some engineering studies there. Then I went back to Fort Belvoir, and I got into the 31st Engineers, which was a demonstration team to educate the other high-ranking officers of other branches of service what engineers could do for them in under combat situation, such as if you had the where we would have maybe the infantry there, we would the engineers could build bridges for them to get across, or they could the engineers could crack pillboxes, use flamethrowers and everything to assist the infantry for taking an objective. From there, I went to California. I was selected out of the 31st Engineers to go to California to a battalion that was being formed of more experienced people of various occupations. We were building up a facilities, and we had a refinery that we had loaded onto 3 Liberty ships and other equipment, and we were to go to the South Pacific in the area of Borneo, Java, and Sumatra, which was the oil fields that the Japanese had taken over from the Dutch Shell Oil Company. And that's where the Japanese were getting all their petroleum products from. Primarily it was the crude oil that they were getting, because Japan did not have any amount of petroleum itself in Japan. So the first objective that the Japanese took over was to take over the Dutch oil fields to support their Air Corps and all their oil-burning ships.
Mm-hmm.
So at California, this battalion that was being formed, there was a change in strategy, that they disbanded this battalion, and we as an individual company went overseas to really support the Air Force with our petroleum products. And our petroleum products, aviation gas and whatnot, had to be transported all the way from Aruba is actually where they picked it up. The tankers would come through the canal and out to the South Pacific and would supply the various airfields that we were being making in the South Pacific as our progression towards taking over, occupying Japan. Now, it took us from Camp Han to New Guinea, it took us 19 days. We started out from San Francisco with 4 brand new APAs. Those are Armed Personnel Attachment ships. They were all brand new. They were made up in the Kaiser shipyards at Washington, in Washington, and they sailed down to San Francisco. We boarded them, and in 19 days out to New Guinea was our first land that we saw. When we took a southern route, the idea was to take a rather southern route to get out of the range of the Japanese submarines. They could only range so far, and because of their basic fuel requirements. And so we zigged and zagged across the Pacific, and took us 19 days to get out to the most eastern tip of New Guinea. Then it took another we unloaded some of the people, the 1,500 Army crew there, and then we continued on for 5 more days to Hollandia, which was a big port. Initially had belonged to the Dutch government, and we disembarked there. Then I and there were 11 of us. I and 10 others, 1 lieutenant, went on an advance party, flying from New Guinea to Biak, which was a big air base that had been established. And then from Biak we flew to the island of Morotai. Now Morotai was the farthest island that we ever took to the west. From there, Morotai was a small island, it was in the Molucca group. And there was a big island almost surrounds Morotai, which the Japanese had 7 airfields on there. So they had 7 fighter airstrips and some bomber strips. Those were, after we had established the basis there on Morotai, those airfields were pretty well neutralized right from the beginning. And the 13th Bomber Group, plus part of the 5th Air Force Fighter Group, was bombing the islands to the islands and whatnot to the west in Borneo, Java, Sumatra, which was a source of all the fuel that raw material and some fuel. Now the Japanese could fuel up their ships, their heavy equipment, battle wagons and cruisers and that they were all oil-fired steam. They could fill them up and use the raw crude for firing those. But for the fighter planes and aircraft, the 100-octane gas, they had to take the Japanese had to take that crude oil to Japan to refine it for aviation gas, and then they supplied their carriers and everything in Japan with the aviation gas. So the objective of the 5th Air Force, 5th Fighter Group, to protect the 13th Air Force bombers that went out to neutralize these oil fields, because actually the war ran on petroleum and its necessity. So the Air Force tried to, there was a refinery down there, but they couldn't manufacture aviation gas. It was only lower grades of gas that they could manufacture. So they bombed those couple of refineries, tried to neutralize the oil fields. At the same time, there were PT boats patrolling there to try to cut off the submarines and tankers that were taking the fuel to Japan. From there, after that was pretty well neutralized and whatnot, we went on, we took another Liberty ship, and another 10 days took us up to the island of Luzon, and we disembarked in Manila, and then we went over to the peninsula of Bataan. On Bataan, we had 7 engineering companies there, and again, we were building up the fuel situation for Clark Field, which was being established. Now, Clark Field was bombing the other islands closer to Japan, Okinawa and whatnot. And so we built 40,000 barrel tanks, pipelines and everything. And then Subic Bay, which was a naval base, we pumped fuel up to there, which was about 30 miles away, and Clark Field was even further than that. So we built up all these big tanks and pipelines and everything. The tankers used to come in to, that they went all the way from Aruba up to, and got into the Manila Bay and unloaded the fuel there, and then of course we took care of trying to support the air forces. So we were all packed up, ready to go into the second wave of Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima, and then later Nagasaki. So we were all packed up, ready to go in the second wave, but that finished the festivities of the war.
Didn't you build some bridges too?
Yeah, we built on Bataan. We built up. As I say, there were 7 engineering companies there. One was a forestry division that did nothing but cut trees and cut the trees. They were big trees, all. And they cut them up, and they were rebuilding. Most of this lumber that they were cutting up was rebuilding the devastation that had been caused in Manila and in the surrounding area of the Philippines.
And you didn't call them bridges though. What'd you call them?
Bridges?
Yeah, instead of bridges, what'd you call them?
Targets.
Well, we didn't have to build any bridges in the Philippines. But if we had to build bridges, they did a lot of bridge building in Europe. They had to ford a lot of rivers and whatnot.
Okay.
So the engineers that were in Europe were doing a lot of bridge building.
Okay.
We didn't encompass that particular need. But these various engineering companies on Bataan, one was a mosquito abatement, one was a bridge and a dock building company, and we traded personnel back and forth. If they needed more men in one company to do something, we would supply men back and forth to the various engineering companies.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Well, via letters. They were all censored. Took weeks to get back home, but that's the way we did it in those days.
What was the food like?
The food, well, it was
Could you call
adequate.
it food?
It was adequate. We didn't get a lot of our food was canned beef that came from Australia, and it was tough beef. It was canned beef stew and dehydrated potatoes, dehydrated eggs, and but it was you lived on it. It was adequate to keep you going. Milk was at that time they had powdered milk that we got a little bit of, but not too much. Coffee, we got coffee, and that was about it from the food standpoint. As far as taking pictures was concerned, that was pretty tough. Some of the fellows' families mailed film to us, and they'd have to put a can it, so that it was the humidity was so bad out there that when you open up the film and out of canned arrangement, you had to use it up right away. Otherwise, the next day it would be all stuck together. It wouldn't even unroll roll in the camera. But then the worst part of it was after you took the pictures, there was no way of developing them. We couldn't develop them. I did at the final stages after the armistice was signed and with Japan, I did get into Manila a couple of times, and I bought a few pictures from a Chinese photographer that he had taken. One of the pictures I have is a little snapshot of the Bataan Death March, and
Do you have it there?
I have it here, and it was. He had to risk his life in order to take it from the Bataan Death March, and but.
Well, lift it up. I can zoom in on it.
I don't know that you could really. I don't really think you can get much because actually it is now fading quite a bit. We have pictures of the dock that we built it for the tankers and the various things that we did at on Bataan. I also, here is the Bataan Death March that this Chinese photographer took.
Oops, wrong one. On the upper left there?
And then to the right of that is a snapshot taken by a very distant relative of the devastation at Hiroshima. That was taken about 2 weeks after the bomb dropped at Hiroshima by this distant relative. It was one of the first ones in on the ground to see what the devastation was. But it was very difficult because we were never in the area where we could get things developed. Even if we got film from home and took it, we couldn't get it developed.
What's there on the lower left?
On the lower left, the lower left is
I'm sorry. Yeah, where your finger is.
is where we were. Our tents that we were on Bataan. Now, at nighttime, mosquitoes were ferocious on Bataan, and of course that's why we had this engineering company for eradication of mosquitoes on Bataan.
Is that you on the pole there?
And that was me on the pole in the area of our camp, setting up facilities there.
Who's the guy you have your arm around? Up
at the
Yeah.
that is one of our master sergeants in the company.
Oh, okay. What's that beach there?
That is a view of the Manila Bay taken from Bataan. And the pictures above, I doubt that you could even get them, is where we were laying the pipelines from the tank area and the pumping stations and everything that we set up on Bataan to Clark Field and Manila Bay and Subic Bay, I should say.
Actually, I can actually read the
You can.
Yeah. But what other pictures do you have there? I mean, flip the page. What else you got?
One of the big things we did at Bataan was this picture down over here is a picture of the water purification plant that we built. And we took the water out of a river, gravitied up from high up in the hills, gravitied down through a 8-inch pipe down into the water purification plant. We had each unit in there run by gasoline pumps and whatnot, process 60,000 gallons of water a day. And we had the 3 units running by the time we finished, and we were processing 180,000 gallons of
How long did it take
water a day. It took about 24 hours to process 60,000 gallons.
How long did it take you to build, though?
It took us about 2 months. And then we pumped that up into a 10,000 barrel tank that we had up in the hills, and gravity did that down through a 6-inch pipe out to the oil jetty. After the during the
Is that a picture of that pipeline right there?
yeah, that's the jetty going out there, and we gravitied the water out to ships that came in, because the ships that were coming into Manila would come across to Bataan, pick up water, because that saved them a lot of fuel and everything to get fresh water. So later on, it was a blessing for all the ships to be able to get water to save fuel for processing through distillation.
What's with the monkey?
The monkey was one that was a camp follower, and he was just a pet of the camp.
Did you give him a name?
To tell you the truth, I can't remember what his name was.
I see your tent group there. Which one is you?
The handsome one.
I can't get that close.
I'm the one in the 1, 2, 3, 4 on the bottom. I'm the for looking at the picture, I'm the third one from the right. Third one from the left, I should say.
Cool.
But that was our tent group. We had 12 men to a tent.
Mm-hmm.
This guy.
Wow. Then and now.
Yeah. Then and now is quite a difference.
What's the other one?
The same thing.
He had hair then.
You're right.
What else you got in the album there?
What else?
After the war,
What are these?
after the armistice was signed, we stayed on for building up the facilities for Clark Field and Subic Bay, and for reconstruction in the Philippines. And I left Bataan in December of 1945, right at Christmas time, and I shipped out right after the first of the year in 1946 for the United States on a troop ship called the General Breckinridge. It was the first voyage that had made 2 voyages across to England, bringing troops back, and then they diverted it out to the South Pacific. So I was we were the first passage of that ship, bringing troops back to United States. It took us 15 days from Manila back to San Francisco, direct route at 18.6 knots per speed.
Isn't that where you met someone special in San Francisco?
Well, you mean the wife? I met her in California before I went overseas, when we were staying at that, in Torrance there, at that pipe company where we were quartered before we formed and went overseas.
You got a picture there?
Yeah. That one?
Yeah, that's the. It was nothing but an empty storage shed, vacant at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and we used it for quartering.
United Concrete Pipe Corp.
Yeah, it was, and it was also good training for the Philippines, and because it was a mosquito haven there in California as well. It was on Bataan.
What did you do after the war?
After I came back, I was in service 3 years, 1 month, and 1 day. I came back to San Francisco. We got on a train, and we were train wrecked in,
Who's we?
on the Denver Rio Grande, returning to Chicago in January, and it was the coming around through the Royal Gorge route on the Denver and Rio Grande. There was a rock slide, and the train couldn't stop. The engineer couldn't stop it fast enough. We were going very slowly. You go very slowly on that Royal Gorge route because it twists along the river. And he ran up on this rock pile that had slid down and derailed the engine and the coal tender, because it was coal-fired steam on the train at that time, and the first car. And so they built, there was enough space around there that the railroad crew built a spur around it, and they had backed up a switching engine on the back end of the train, and we passed our original engine and coal car and first car there on the rock pile, so as to speak. They didn't tip over. It was a small shale rock that had slid down and just covered the rails, and the engine and the coal car and the first car had just run the trucks right up onto all this gravel, so-called gravel, you might almost call it, the shale. And they hadn't turned over anything, but they were stranded and were going to be there for days till they could get some rails under them, dig the pile of rock away and get some rails back under them. And so then we continued on to Denver and then back to Camp Grant in Chicago, where that was then called the Separation Center, and spent about 2 days there, and then you were given a physical, and if you wanted dental work done that you probably needed, being in overseas for so long, they would do the dental work, and then they would allow you to go home. And so I took the train from Camp Grant home into Chicago. Camp Grant was outside of Rockford, Illinois.
Did you
And
work?
that ended the military experience.
When you got back, did you work or?
I went back to my original job. They were waiting for me. And for years afterwards,
What job was that?
I was in the, worked for Western Electric in the telephone industry. And because of the wartime conditions, and even before the war, Western Electric had to stop telephone manufacturing to work on radar equipment, and so the telephone companies had just struggled in the United States, had struggled along throughout the war with the telephone switching equipment that they had. And then there was such a demand after the war for modernization and repair and replacement of telephone offices that we were really working night and day. And I went from the drafting department to the engineering department in the telephone industry.
Did you keep in touch with anybody from your?
There was only, our unit was made up of all specialists for various, some were from Oklahoma. We had a lot of fellas from Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana that had more or less gas line experiences, building pipelines and whatnot. And we had some from Pennsylvania, from the oil fields. I was selected initially because of my telephone experience and electrical experience. Was why I was originally selected to go into this particular unit. I didn't. So we were a scattered bunch from all over the country, as I say. I kept in touch with one fella from Brooklyn and another from upstate New York and one from southern Illinois. I lost contact with the one from southern Illinois because he moved and whatnot. The best friend I had was the one from upstate New York, and he passed away not too long after the war. He had a heart attack and died at a very early age. The fellow from Brooklyn, later on in years, I made a lot of business trips to New York for the operating companies of New York Tel and New Jersey Tel, but his wife was a total invalid, and I never really I talked to him on the phone. I never got to really see him whenever I went on business trips. So the keeping in touch with all these fellows was various, and we were all separated at different times, so it made it rather difficult. We weren't all separated from service around the same time or traveled back to the States at the same time. So, as I say, from our whole company of 220, we very, very few contacts between the people. In our company, we had 65 welding machines that we used for building all these tanks, welding the tanks together and the pipelines and all of that. And
have you gone to any reunions since the war?
No, there was never any a cohesion group, because we were separated in increments from the bunch. So as a company, if we had been like in a battalion and come back in a group, it was those kind of groups that had kept in touch. I think actually the Navy and the Air Corps had more groups that were separated at the same time, and they've had reunions. I ran into a couple of reunions of Navy people on some trips we had, vacation trips that we had made, but our group was such a made together from all over the country. Why it was, there was never any arrangement for reunions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you join any veterans?
No, I never. As I say, when I got back after the war, we worked nights and weekends and everything, trying to supply the telephone companies with new equipment and worn out equipment. Illinois Bell was one that held on to their operators towards all through the war. They had not modernized as fast as New York Tel, Bell Tel of Pennsylvania or New Jersey as some of the others. And Illinois Bell, at that time, then we were really giving them, making new equipment for them, switching equipment for all their exchanges to replace their manual A boards and B boards that they had at that time. Then as technology went on, we eliminated the so-called A boards, which was the switching equipment from the customer to the next customer through manual operation. We did it with automatic equipment. Then later on, it was the long distance. The next 3 digits for long distance that was taking switching equipment to eliminate the operators on the long distance boards.
did any of your wartime experience like help you with?
Oh, not particularly. Not particularly in the in our telephone industry. Didn't really.
Not specifically there, but in general.
Well, you gain no matter where you are, you gain experience of some nature, and yeah, there are little offshoot arrangements that help, but directly no, because the wartime experiences was in the petroleum field, and my work experience was in the electrical communication field, so there was not too much help either way.
Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that about takes us up to where the end of the military experience and the link between that and how I got into the branch of engineering.
Well, thank you.
It was interesting as a sidelight, as an interesting thing. The classification board at the induction centers were the ones that put people where they were needed, or perhaps where they best fit, and it all depended upon the classification interviewer where you went. And we had one, as I was sitting there at in this classification, there were three fellas, three in a row, and three soldiers being interviewed, three trainees, or not even trainees yet, being interviewed. I was in the center. The one to the left of me was a rather young fella, and the classification expert was trying to get from this particular individual as to what his qualifications were and whatnot. Now, he was probably, it looked to me to be 18 or 19 years old, hadn't had a lot of experience, but he was expounding on his experience. He knew how to run a shaper, he knew how to run a drill press and a machine, milling machine and other things. And the interviewer was trying to get to him as to how precise his working was. And he said to them, well, how close did you work? And this young chap said, well, I worked about this close. The interviewer was trying to, were you working with 100,000th of an inch or 10,000th of an inch or something? And so he said, when he said, I worked this far away, the classification guy said, well, fine, that's it. Okay. And he left. And he said to this other classification guy, on the other side of my guy, he said, did you ever hear of anything like that? And the fellow said, yeah, I asked the fellow the other day when he got out of school, and he said 3 o'clock. Now, I presume that both of those guys that were being interviewed went to the infantry. And so my interview
good thing too.
concluded with me, and I went to the engineers, so, which was a more, more upscale, you might say, division of the Army. But,
so when you were in the Pacific, were you very close to the fighting at all? The actual fighting?
We were never close to really ground combat. In the Philippines, we came close, but the Japanese had retreated, so we really didn't have to retake the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor and whatnot. The Japanese had actually retreated. The Japanese had cut themselves so thin by going over all the islands and whatnot that they stretched their troops so thin that they couldn't really, in the islands outside of Okinawa and a few of those that they had dug in as last-ditch areas, the Japanese didn't offer a great deal of ground resistance, and where we were there to neutralize in Morotai and whatnot, to neutralize the effort of the oil industry for Japan, which was accomplished actually.
What was your rank when you left the service?
When I left, I was a tech sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
The next one was a master sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
I was one below the master sergeant.
Did you receive any decorations?
Decorations I received were quite a number as I read my discharge papers yesterday. They were at the separation center. They didn't have these various things. They couldn't hand them out overseas because we were just too busy handing out decorations and whatnot. And they promised at the separation center we would get these, whether I can't remember that far back whether I signed any papers or anything, but outside of initial rifle marksmanship medals and whatnot that we got in the training camp, any of those awards were never really made at the separation centers. They just didn't have the thing, and well, we'll catch up with it later. I suppose if I'd have pursued it, I might got those things, bars and stripes, but I never did. And
Where'd you meet your wife?
I met my wife when we were in California. She when we were stationed in forming this particular battalion, we were not all in the same place. This battalion was separated into smaller groups, and I was in Torrance, California, stationed in this pipe company. I was working at the Boyle Manufacturing Company, which is a subsidiary of U.S. Steel, getting experience with high voltage. This particular plant manufactured 50-gallon drums, which was a big thing in the wartime effort. All the stuff for the various troops generally came in 50-gallon drums or other type of arrangement. We used 50-gallon drums by the thousands on Morotai because when we pumped the gas up from the tankers into the tanks, we also took fresh supplies from that and we put them in 50-gallon drums and hid them in the jungle there, so that in case we didn't get a tanker, and twice we did not get a tanker in on schedule, we had to go and tap the reserve supplies that were in the jungle. Now, you couldn't leave the gas, aviation gas, more than 30 days in a drum in that climate, or what they called soured. So we had a one of our operations was a continual turnover of taking the gas out of the emergency supplies in the jungle and blending it with new gas that we got, and that went to the aircraft, and then we would fill up the drum again with fresh supplies. But we had a continual rotation of gasoline into the emergency supplies in the jungle, and then taking that, which was getting up to the age limit, blending that with new supplies into pumping it up to the airstrip. I was trying to think of the other part of the question you asked me. As far as combat is concerned, the Japanese bombed us at Morotai incessantly at nighttime. And our planes bombed them in the daytime. We went out in groups of 20 and 30 B-24s and B-25s, and then they were escorted by our fighter craft from the 5th Air Force later on. The bombers would start out first, and then finally our fighter group to protect them when they reached the area of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, in there where they were meeting resistance. Then our fighters would catch up to them and get just about that point when they would get there, and they would try to protect them from Japanese fighters at that area.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of P-38s, and those were really something to see when they would go out. They would go out in the morning, and then there would be another contingent go out in the afternoon, and they would be loaded with 3 tanks. And they would go out, and they would, with 3 external tanks, a belly tank and 2 wing tanks, and they'd go out in groups of 3. And they would be trying to get to the Japanese. That was the first arrangement that was, as an expedient before napalm came in. And the one fighter would they would follow one another. One guy would drop a tank, and the next one would fire into that thing as it slammed inward. The Japs might be holed up in caves and whatnot, and he'd fire tracers into it and ignite it. And then they just keep going around in a circle till they expended the 9 tanks between all of them, the 3 tanks on each one, the 9 tanks. They'd then come back and get another 3 would go out and fire that. We also had, on Morotai, we had a contingent of Japanese fighters. I'm not Japanese, I mean Australian Air Force. And they had, were using our P-40s that we had given them. And they would go out with one, they only had arrangement on those for 1 belly tank. But they went out daily in groups of 35 and 40 of these P-40s at a time. And they would be out there also trying to neutralize the Japanese facilities that they had taken over from the Dutch. We also had a lot of PT boats come in that we refueled at Morotai.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were Australian PT boats. And
Do you have any close calls?
no, not well. One night I was on. We had a tanker in discharging, and the tanker would drop off part of its load at the island of Biak, which was a great big air base to take care of them, and then we would get the remainder of what they had up at Morotai. We had a tanker in discharging, and of course they wanted to get out of there as fast as they could. And as I say, the Japanese would bomb us at night. And the one night I was up on a tank. We had to sit up on the tank while they were filling, because when one tank was getting nearly full, we'd have to clamber down and go to another tank, open that up, then come back over and shut the valve off from from the tanker to that tank once it was full. And the one night, normally the bombing took place on the airstrip or towards the airstrip, but the one night they wanted to apparently try to bomb the tank farm. And they usually had 6 500-pound bombs, or 200-pound bombs, I think it was, or a combination of it. And they would be bombing us at night. And the one night, as they say, they were coming in and they dropped 5 bombs, and it was out in the bay, and one after another, and the last one would have hit right into the tank farm, but there weren't 6, there were 5. And the next morning when the tide came in, oh boy, the talk about stink. all the fish that they had killed. The tide brought them in, and we couldn't even get down near the pumping station that we had was close. The pumping station was close to the water.
Yeah.
Because that was at the lowest point from the tank farm, so we would try to get the header of the gravity into the pumps to pump it up to 5 miles to the airfield, to the airstrip. At the airstrip, we had three series of tanks. They were 1,000-gallon tanks, and the problem we had at Morotai was we were always getting the last amount of gas from the tanker, and that contained water.
Oh.
So we would have to bleed the tanks, our big tanks, try to bleed the water out of it. Then as we pumped it up to the airstrip, there sometimes as the tank would get low, we would get some of this water. So you'd get up at the top tank, and the tank at the airstrip we had on 3 levels. So we always took the top level off of that tank to go into the second level of tanks, and take the top level of that into the third level of tanks before the tankers would take it from there to then fill up the tankers to take it out to the airstrip to put it in the planes.
Because the water is going to the bottom.
Yeah, the water was always at the bottom. So we had to always try to tap the water out of these 3 levels of tanks. And then at the airstrip, they actually fueled the bombers and filled the aircraft through a big funnel that had a chamois at the bottom, because they didn't want a teaspoonful of water in those in the engines, because if the water got in the thing, and after they were up high, this water could, as it went through the line, could freeze and freeze an engine, just starve an engine off.
Wow.
So, although it was usually salt water, because when the tanker finished emptying to us, we were the last outpost. The tanker would steam the tanks down to get any of the vapor out, and then they would fill up with salt water to go back, because they always wanted a low profile in the thing, and of course the tanker rode better. If it was empty, it was more subject to breakup in rough weather.
Oh.
So the tankers always went back full of water, and then they would have to dump it over wherever they were picking up the fuel.
Did you ever go through the
Tanker?
the canal?
Oh yeah, well, I've been through the canal twice. Once on a small 70-passenger boat, and once on a big ocean liner.
But not during the war.
But not during the war. That was after the war. I went through the canal twice, and I get both ideas of it, from a low profile and then from a big liner.
So you were building barrels in California.
We were building barrels in California. The reason I was in this plant was learning. The plant initially was on 220 volt AC, and they were converting this plant over to 440 AC. They had 2 cages of transformers. The voltage came into the transformers about 6,600 volts, and the 3 sets of transformers for the one, because it was all 3-phase system, was 220 from 6,600 to 220, and then the other cage, the new cage they had built, was 440 volts. So they had 66 coming in to 440, and they were converting all the motors in this thing, trying to take like one a night or so, convert one machine to one a night to 440. And so we were wiring the things up for 440, get everything ready, so that at one night you pull a motor off and put another motor in and get the new voltage in and cut dead the other voltage for that one particular machine. The manufacturing arrangement of the thing was the steel would come in rolls. The press, they call a brake, would cut it off into precise lengths. It would then, that particular length, which was the circumference of the thing, would go into a rolling machine, and that would put the curvature into it.
Hmm.
From the curvature arrangement, it went over to what they called a butt welder. The butt welder this curved piece of steel would go over to the butt welder and would be clamped so that the two edges were somewhat close together. Then the butt welder would bring this thing together, the two edges, and then they would apply the voltage to that thing, and it would heat at that point, and then there'd be sparks flying, and it was about 20 seconds, and then the voltage would drop off. It would be cooled for about 10 seconds and come out of the machine. And whenever the two butt welders in this plant that they had, two lines working, they were timed so they didn't put the load on at the same time, because whenever that butt welder cut in, although this plant was about 2 blocks square, the lights would dim because it took that much current to weld the seam up the.
We've got about 30 seconds left.
Okay.
So any other questions, Sharon?
Not really. You're basically covering it all.
Okay.
So my experience in the boil manufacturing was working with the electricians in